Well, let's stand together as I begin our time by reading from the end of Ruth chapter 3. Please look at the screen. And when Ruth came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man Boaz had done for her. Naomi replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our Lord remains forever. You may be seated. When you're 15 and somebody tells you they love you, you're going to believe them. Taylor Swift, in her song 15, shares the blissful naivete of being a freshman in high school, especially when it comes to dating. She describes the nerves of entering that high school for the first time and the butterflies you would feel if that cute senior boy were to look at you and wink at you and say, "I've never seen you before." She describes that first feeling of independence when an older boy picks you up in his car and you get to drive away together without your parents, and how exciting it is to have that first date and to come home and just be filled with so much joy and dance around your bedroom and just be so excited for those feelings of young love. But she also describes in this song the devastation of having your heart broken for the very first time. You know, in a line that has always haunted me for some reason, Taylor describes how her friend Abigail gave everything she had to a boy who changed his mind. To this day, Taylor says that when she sings that or thinks of that line, she still gets emotional remembering that heartbreak at 15 of a relationship ending that her friend experienced. You know, jumping headfirst into a teenage relationship only to be dumped is a rude awakening, and for many, it's that moment where adolescent innocence is lost. That first sting of rejection can be so painful. Now, judging by the crowd in this room, I guess there aren't too many Swifties in here, Taylor Swift fans. Maybe there's some. But maybe you're a fan of 90s country. In that case, think of the song Walkaway Joe by Trisha Yearwood, which tells a very similar story. It's the story of an overeager 17-year-old girl who has fallen head over heels for a very bad boy. And despite her mom warning her that this relationship isn't going to last, she flings herself into the arms of this deadbeat guy. And so when things end up falling apart, the girl remembers the words of her mom. That boy's just a walkaway Joe. He's born to be a leaver. Tell you from the word go, destined to deceive her. She's going to know it in a matter of time that boy's just a walkaway Joe. And my guess is that you've had that happen to you before. That you've had a moment in your life where someone was a walkaway Joe for you. That they initially liked you, but they eventually left you. Like maybe what happened to you is a lot like those songs about heartbreak. Maybe you met a guy or a girl who you fell in love with, who you thought that you were one day going to marry, or maybe who you did marry, but who, after a while, decided they didn't feel the same way. You gave her everything, but she changed her mind. You loved him, but he betrayed you. He was a walkaway Joe. Or maybe for you, it was your family. Maybe you have a dad who literally walked out of your life. Like maybe your mom got pregnant with you and so he decided to leave. He got scared and left. Or maybe he left when you were still really little. Maybe you have that memory in your mind of him walking out that front door. Or maybe you had a mom who was there physically, but was absent emotionally, right? Who was never available to talk, who could be verbally abusive, or who was always glued to the television or was zoned out on drugs. Maybe you've had that experience. To be abandoned like that is painful. It's traumatic. Or maybe you had this happen in your career. Like you sold your soul to that company. You dedicated countless hours and many years of your job, putting in that overtime and always saying yes whenever they'd call you to come in, maybe even to the detriment of your own family. Maybe you considered your coworkers and even your managers to be your closest friends, which is why, after you made one small mistake, you couldn't believe how quickly they seemed to turn on you and how easily they let you go. To give your workplace your all, yet to be dismissed after one mishap cuts like a knife. We all fear a walkaway Joe. Someone who will leave you the moment loving you gets hard. And as we continue our series in the book of Ruth, it turns out that Ruth had a walkaway Joe of sorts in her life as well. Well, believe it or not, we have just 2 more weeks left in this message series. And so, needless to say, this morning marks the beginning of the end of this extraordinarily ordinary true story. As we've emphasized throughout the course of this series, if you look closely, what Ruth is about is how God is at work in the mundane and typical aspects of life, and he's at work to bring about his greater purposes. Though he is hardly mentioned, if you pay close enough attention, you can see how God is at work in every single moment of Ruth. Because this book is filled with what some would call coincidences, but are anything but. Like after how Ruth just so happens to glean in the field of a kind man named Boaz, who just so happens to be a relative of her deceased husband, and also just so happens to be what's called a kinsman redeemer. Some would call this a stroke of luck, but we know this really is the sovereignty of the Lord. But just because God is at work doesn't mean that Naomi and Ruth don't have to do anything at all, right? In fact, what we saw last week is that these women took some pretty audacious actions to kind of help God's plan move into action. In a strange and somewhat scandalous passage, Ruth sneaks up on an unsuspecting Boaz in the middle of the night and awakens him with a bold request that he would take her as his wife, and in doing so, redeem the legacy of Naomi's deceased husband, Elimelech. It's definitely unconventional, but luckily, her plan works. Boaz is flattered by the request and promises to be the redeemer. Except, there's one little problem. There's one person closer in relation to Naomi than he is. And in this case, that guy has first dibs, so to speak. But Boaz promises Ruth that he's going to sort all of this out. And so Act 3 of this 4-part real-life drama ends in verse 18 with the reassuring words of Naomi. Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. And so we're left in suspense. We're wondering what is going to happen next. Well, thankfully, we will find out soon in this dramatic 2-part finale of the story of Ruth. Let's hop into our passage now. If you have a Bible, open it to Ruth chapter 4, and we're going to begin by reading verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. And so Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. Now I want you to notice the wording here. Boaz goes and sits at the gate, and guess who just so happens to show up at the gate? It's the man he was looking for, right? He just so happens, behold, by coincidence, comes and walks to the gate. Now, you might be wondering who this guy is, but interestingly, Boaz does not call him by his name, nor does the narrator ever give us his name. But I think you'll get a kick out of this because the Hebrew word that's used to describe this guy is a rhyming phrase, polani alamani, which would be equivalent to calling him Mr. So-and-so, or more accurately, Joe Blow. Like, this guy is literally Joe Blow. We don't know his name. He's a generic guy. His real identity is not mentioned, and that is entirely on purpose. He's left anonymous for a reason, which I'll get to later on. So Boaz just so happens to run into Joe Blow, but we know this is very much a divine appointment. And the two sit down for an important conversation. Let's keep reading. Look at verse 2. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." And so they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, bide in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." All right, so Boaz and Joe Blow, the Redeemer, talk shop. Surprisingly, Boaz begins the discussion of redemption not by bringing up Ruth or talking about marriage to Ruth, but rather by discussing a plot of land that belongs to Elimelech, Naomi's deceased husband, which, if you've been paying attention, this is news to us in this narrative. Like, we at this point had no idea that Naomi owned land, which should raise other questions, like why wasn't this mentioned before? And if Naomi was so desperate, why didn't she sell the land and take the money from that sale to provide for her and Ruth? Well, although we don't know the details, here's what we can assume has happened. So back in chapter 1, when Bethlehem was struck by a severe famine, Elimelech, we assume, was forced to sell his land to someone outside of his clan. And since the only other thing he could do to provide for himself was to sell himself as an indentured servant, Elimelech decides that a better option would be to move his family out of Bethlehem to the country of Moab and start anew. However, per Israelite law, the land rightfully belongs back to Elimelech and his clan. And since Naomi does not have the means or the ability to buy that land back, she requires a redeemer to do so for her. And so Boaz decides to bring up this land in his conversation with Joe Blow, though it certainly is not the most important item that will be discussed. And in doing so, Boaz makes it clear that he desires to purchase the land, but wants to give this closer redeemer first dibs. In fact, in a fascinating play on words, Boaz tells them that he wishes to uncover his ear concerning this matter. That's the Hebrew phrase. It's an idiom that harkens to the idea of uncovering the hair from your ear so that someone can whisper in your ear to tell you a secret. But we should notice, if we've been paying attention, that word uncover harkens back to what event in the book of Ruth? What has just happened in chapter 3? Yep, the uncovering of the feet. So it seems that Ruth's proposal to Boaz has led him to make this proposal. Since land was a key tool for building wealth, Mr. So-and-so is quick to say, yes, I'll redeem it. Though buying the land would be a financial commitment, the benefit of owning that land would far offset it. And since Naomi does not have children or grandchildren, the land could be added to his own children's inheritance, assuming that Job Blow has kids. With this in mind, we as an audience should, at this moment, feel the tension, right? The suspense, like the Redeemer has accepted the offer. But what about Ruth? What does this mean for her and Naomi? How come Boaz hasn't mentioned her yet? Does Boaz have anything else up his sleeve? Well, it turns out he does. Look at verse 5. Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." So Job Blow is eager to redeem the land, but wait, there's a catch. There's more to the story, because in redeeming the land, Boaz says, you also redeem Ruth the Moabite. So he kind of pulls this stipulation out as a trump card. But the burning question that we should have is, on what basis does Boaz say this? Because if you remember from a couple of weeks ago, one of the things we talked about is that in the Old Testament law, there is no mention of a redeemer's responsibility to marry the widow of a deceased relative. The law does not outline that sort of action being necessary. So why then would Boaz claim that this is a necessary part of the deal? Well, something we have to know about the cultural context of Ruth and the Old Testament is a broader understanding of heritage. You see, there was a close link between the concepts of one's name, offspring, and land. As one commentator explains, a man's name was primarily preserved through the inheritance of property by his descendants, which means that in this culture, one of the worst things that could happen to you is to have your name cut off from the face of the earth because you don't have anyone to inherit your name nor your property. What Boaz is doing here is connecting the redemption of property with another Old Testament idea called levirate marriage, which was when a man would be obligated to marry his brother's widow in order to prolong his legacy. Because the ideal in ancient Israel would be for the land to not only be bought back, but also to have it be restored to the rightful line of inheritance associated with the name of the deceased owner. Boaz begins with a discussion about the land because that takes legal precedent, but then he also presents the connected issue of preserving the name of the dead by taking Mahlon's widow Ruth in marriage and having offspring that will technically, by law, bear his name. Buying the land is one thing, but for Job Blow, prolonging someone else's inheritance is a whole other issue. So let's see how he responds. Look at verse 6. Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in a former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Because the price is too high to pay, this would-be Redeemer walks away. Job Blow is quite literally a walk-away Joe. He walks away from this deal. Why does he walk away? Because, as he says in verse 6, "I don't want to ruin my own inheritance." Now, how does marrying Ruth ruin his inheritance? Well, there could be some number of possibilities. Like maybe he's already married and doesn't want to cause any tension with his current spouse. Maybe he's not fond of marrying a foreigner, a Moabite, like Ruth was. However, the most likely reason that he does not want to do this is that he is thinking about the fate of his own inheritance after he dies. Now, what's say in this scenario that Joe Blow does not have any kids. If he marries Ruth, his firstborn son will technically be considered the son of Ruth's deceased husband, Mahlon, and will thereby be the inheritor of not only the land that he is going to purchase from Naomi, but also all the other land that this guy owns if he doesn't have any more kids. So that might be in the back of his mind, but he also might be thinking about the fact that Ruth has a reputation of being infertile, right? If you remember, Ruth was married to Mahlon for 10 years, and they didn't have any kids. And so this guy might know this and might be thinking about the fact that, I might not be able to have any kids with Ruth. And she's getting up in age as well, and so that biological window is closing. So that could be something this guy's thinking about. But let's say that he already has a family of his own, that he already has kids. Well, he might be turned off by the prospect of having to support not just Ruth, but also Naomi, his mother-in-law, and also any other kids that come from this relationship, plus purchasing this land. That could be a risk for him financially. It could plunge him into poverty with all these extra mouths to feed. And so he could be at risk of losing everything. And so putting all these factors together could be just too much of a financial commitment. Whatever his reasoning may be, Joe Blow is now just a Walkaway Joe. He does not want his own inheritance to be put in jeopardy by marrying Ruth. And though he was once considered the Redeemer, he now places the responsibility of redemption into the hands of Boaz. An idea illustrated by not just in our time it would be like signing legal documents or shaking hands, but in this culture they agree to this deal by exchanging shoes. And the author has to explain this to us because it seems that at the time this book was written, this practice of shoe swapping had already gone out of style. I wonder why. It's a pretty weird thing to do. And you might wonder, why would people do this? And the true answer is we don't know for sure. The one speculation is that footwear was like a symbol for ownership and the right of dominion. And so by the kinsman redeemer giving Boaz his shoe, he's saying that he legally relinquishes his right to tread or to walk on the designated property. Needless to say, this strange action makes things official and legal. The right of redemption has been transferred from Joe Blow to Boaz. The Redeemer does not, in fact, redeem. And ironically enough, if you remember, the whole reason behind this is that this guy wants to preserve his name and his legacy for generations. But in doing so, he fades into anonymity, right? Boaz's name is preserved thousands of years in the future. But this guy, he's just Joe Blow, right? We don't know who he is. So now that Boaz has the right of redemption, what does he do? Well, let's check out verse 9. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses to this day." So Boaz is a man of his word. In chapter 3, he told Ruth that he would do all she had asked, and now his words have been put into action. As far as it depends on him, Boaz is doing his part to mend the brokenness of Ruth and Naomi's life. He might not be able to bring her late husband Mahlon back from the dead, but he can step in and provide for her in his place. And as we'll see next week in our Ruth finale, God honors his faithfulness and brings this story that started with tragedy and death full circle, concluding it with joy and new birth. Now, as I reflect on this passage and the interaction between Boaz and Mr. So-and-so here, my mind is brought back to this whole idea of what it means to be a redeemer. To refresh your memory, a kinsman redeemer can be defined as a relative who restores to wholeness that which has been lost, usually at personal cost. Redemption is a right in this culture, but it is a right that comes at a cost. In Ruth 4, the Redeemer jumps at the opportunity to buy the land. At first, for him, the right of redemption is very beneficial. He could increase his wealth from this. But once the stakes are raised, and it becomes clear that redemption would come at a great personal cost, he backs off his initial offer. And if Joe Blow was the only person who redemption depended on, his walking away would be devastating, right? Ruth and Naomi would be left high and dry. They would have to start from square one. It would be heartbreaking for them. But thankfully, there is someone willing to fill his place, and that is Boaz. And certainly the same risks that deterred Joe Blow from redemption would have been true for Boaz. He risks his immediate security by committing to provide for Ruth and Naomi, plus puts his own legacy in jeopardy to prolong the name of his deceased relative. But yet, Boaz displays what I would argue isn't simply a willingness to redeem that comes from a sense of obligation, but rather one that flows from a genuine sense of generosity and kindness. And as we've discussed before in this series, through his act of redemption, Boaz is acting on God's behalf and reflecting the very heart of who God is, the great Redeemer. As the Redeemer, God acts in kindness towards those who cannot help themselves by rescuing them from their plight. In the Old Testament, the clearest example of this is the Exodus account, right? The Israelites are hopelessly enslaved. They cannot get themselves free. But God comes in and literally, in a very powerful way, purchases them back. He brings them out of physical bondage. He redeems them. And by redeeming Ruth and lifting both her and Naomi out of poverty, Boaz acts as an instrument of God's grace towards these women. He is displaying God's redeeming kindness to them in a tangible and sacrificial way. However, as we look at Boaz's redeeming kindness, which points us to God's redeeming kindness, we know that these acts of redemption find their ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ. And I just want to end our time by marveling at the truth that we need to remind ourselves of. That Jesus, our Redeemer, did not walk away. Jesus did not walk away. He did not walk away from you. He did not walk away from the act of redeeming you, even though it came so at a great personal cost that we can't even begin to fathom. Consider the sacrificial kindness of our Redeemer, who, though being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. He cast aside all the privileges that come from being the Son of God, from being the Lord of the universe, and stepped into our pain-filled world. Consider how in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus prayed in agony, begging God to remove the cup of suffering from him, yet declaring, "Not my will, but yours be done." In that moment where the temptation to run from this act of redemption would have been its greatest, Jesus did not walk away. He did not abandon you, but obediently and generously submitted himself to the will of the Father. Consider how we have been ransomed and redeemed from our sin, not with money or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. His blood was the precious price paid to pardon sin. And that's the beauty of the gospel, that God loved you and I so much that he did not turn from us because of our sin, but actually ran to us to redeem us. Right? And this idea is profoundly illustrated in the parable of the prodigal son. If you know the story, the son rejects his father by collecting his inheritance money early, which was equivalent to him telling his dad, hey, I wish you were dead. Like, I want your money now. Would you just give it to me now so I don't have to wait around until you die? And the father agrees and gives him his inheritance money. And this young man runs into the city and he squanders this immense sum of money on wild parties and prostitutes. He completely wastes it. And eventually he is left with nothing. And when he comes to his senses, he decides to return to his father to beg him to take him back, not as a son, but just as a servant. And as the story goes, the father sees his son approaching in the distance, and what does the father do? He runs, and we would expect that he'd run away, right? That he would go back into his house, he would lock all the doors, he would turn off all the lights, and he'd tell his servants to be quiet and act like nobody's home because his spoiled, rotten brat of a son is coming back to ask him for more money. That's what we would expect to happen. But that's not what happens at all. He runs, but he runs to his son. He embraces his son, and he welcomes him back into his home. He redeems him. That's the opposite of a walkaway Joe. And when you would think that God would walk away from you in that moment that you are at your lowest, in that moment when you have rejected him through your actions, God actually runs to you. When you come back to him, he runs to you. You know, perhaps you are tempted at times to believe that the lie that if God really knew how messed up you are, if he really knew all the things that you've done in your life, that he would never accept you. That it would be like Job Lowe with Ruth, that once the true price of redemption was revealed, that he would simply choose to walk away. That you would not be worthy of his redemption. And though you are not worthy on your own, Jesus knows the full extent. Right? There is no price that is yet to be revealed when it comes to redemption. In fact, the person who knows how messed up you are the most in all this world is Jesus. But at the very same time, there is not a single person in this world who loves you more and accepts you more than Jesus does. That's the beauty of the gospel. And he paid the price for our sin on the cross. And because of the price he paid, you and I can be saved and redeemed. The prophet Isaiah puts it this way: "Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. And when his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand." Boaz declared in our story that by redeeming Ruth, he would perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. But with Jesus, his inheritance was perpetuated by his death. Because did you notice the second part of this verse? It says that he shall see his offspring. Now, if you know your Bible, you know that Jesus didn't have any kids. So who are his offspring? Who is his inheritance? We are. You are. We are the ones, if we are in Christ, who benefit and receive the gift that his death made possible. Namely, our inheritance, which is eternity in heaven with him. And so when we praise Jesus this morning, that our sin was not too high of a price to pay, that he did not walk away from our mess, but that he gave it all to us in order to buy us back. He is our Redeemer. He is our living hope, the one who sets you free. So let's worship his name this morning. Would you please stand as we conclude with a couple of songs of praise